You're not going to believe this, but the vast majority of people online talking about house hacking have never actually house hacked. Some may not even own real estate. And I can tell based on my personal experience house hacking multiple properties, my experience as a lender back in the day, financing multiple multifamily properties, and talking to folks that are actually living rent free. It's a lot harder than it seems like on paper. So, in today's episode, I'm going to break down what actually is house hacking, what are your goals and how to establish the goals of house hacking, different property types and how that impacts your real estate portfolio, different ways to do it, things to look out for, the ultimate method, the 4-3-2-1 house hack, different loan programs like FHA, conventional, NACA, VA, and how that impacts the ability to house hack, screening renters because you got to get people in those units, and now you're living rent free. What do you do next with all this money that is falling from the sky? Let's get it. Welcome back to House Rich, the first time homebuyer show where we help millennials figure out how in the world do I buy my first home. Today we're talking house hacking. Let's jump right into it with a quick story on my first house hack, a single family property. So if you're listening to the podcast right here on YouTube, I'm showing a picture of this condo, which may look like a multifamily property. And it was a suggestion from my parents to basically get a roommate. This was 10 years ago before house hacking was a cool thing to talk about. So my mortgage was about $1,400 all in. And I essentially picked a number that was about 65 to 70% of the rent. I think the guy was paying maybe about $965 as far as rent. And I picked kind of an odd number to make it seem like I did some sort of calculations. But once again, I didn't have any spreadsheets or I wasn't crunching all these numbers to figure out what the profit and loss would be on the unit. I was just like, hey, this seems like a pretty good number to start with. And so I did some basic screening. I mean, I was in the Navy at the time. The guy was in the Navy too. So I was like, okay, the Navy's a pretty solid job. And I also knew in the Navy, like if you act up in the Navy, like I would never do this, but folks know that like you can call a base and kind of like get the person in trouble if they're not like paying rent or something like that. So that was kind of my screening, was I knew the person wasn't going to act a fool. But this property in particular, it had a couple things I think you should always think about when you're looking to either house hack a property or rent a property. It's like, hey, what would a renter like? And so if you can see from the picture, it's basically on the same side of the water as, or same side of the road as the water. So it wasn't beachfront. There were some condos in between us, but it was beachside as far as the unit. So it's pretty cool. You're in your 20s, you want a property that is near the water. Here we go. Another thing too, going inside the property, which is very, very important, is what I call the bedroom to bathroom ratio. You always want there to be at least one bedroom to one bathroom. So sharing a bathroom seems like it's fine on paper, but if you've ever lived with anyone, sharing a bathroom can be a mess. Like before I moved into a property that I live in right now, I shared a one bedroom, one bathroom with my girlfriend, now and wife at the time. And I was in love with her, but that was a mess sharing with her. So you always want to make sure you have that bedroom to bathroom ratio. And that's what I had in my situation. So I had like the master bedroom. And so I had the ensuite bathroom, and he had like the community bathroom. But once again, respecting your renters' wishes and stuff like that, was that bathroom was just his. So it had the Jack and Jill. It opened on both sides, one to his bedroom and one to the public. But we had the side open to the public lock. So basically, if he had a guest, they could use his bathroom and just open the side that opens to the public so they wouldn't have to go through his bedroom. And if I had a guest, they would just have to go into my bedroom and use the bathroom in there. That was fine. That made sense to kind of keep the peace in there, because you don't want somebody peeing on the seat, or maybe somebody not using a toothbrush. That is a mess. But somebody maybe knocking your toothbrush over, and now someone thinks, hey, did you use my toothbrush? That's just unnecessary strife between renters. And also, since it was a condo, there was no property management fees, because once again, we're in the same property ourselves. There's no need for me to hire anybody else to manage the property. So that was an easy task for me to take on as a first-time homeowner. And also, I don't recommend doing this, so I don't recommend not doing this either, but I actually didn't even tell the person it was my condo, because once again, we were young and I didn't want there to be any jealousy as far as me owning a property, him not owning a property, or him thinking because we're the same age, it'd be cool if he was like late on the rent once or twice or something like that. So actually, unbeknownst to him, my parents were my property managers, and he thought that they owned the property. They weren't my parents. And so he would send the rent to them, and then they would send the rent off to my bank account. And so that worked out well for me. House hacked this property for 5 years, and the guy never knew that I owned it. So that's my quick personal story. But let's get into some stuff that could help you. Hope you enjoyed that though. House hacking. So, like, what is house hacking? House hacking is simply a strategy that involves renting out a portion of your primary residence to generate income that's used to offset. The key word there is offset. Like, all these folks running around talking about, live rent free and all this. I know most folks aren't doing it because really you need at least a 3 or 4 unit property in order to live rent free when you're house hacking. The vast majority of people are going to have somebody covering between like 50 and 80% of the rent, which is kind of what my situation was with just a single family property. And it's to offset the cost of your mortgage and other expenses associated with owning a home. All right, let's talk about some goal setting. So, if you really, really, really want to live rent free, you need to focus on a 3 or 4 unit property. That's really the only way to do it in one fell swoop. But one thing you need to think about, and I'll get into more detail later in the episode, is the FHA self sufficiency test. What it says is that your mortgage can be no more than 75% of the rent on the 3 or 4 units. So essentially, if you're in a 4 unit property and 1 unit is either unoccupied or you're in that unit, the property breaks even. So think about this. If the property is breaking even with only 3 people renting the property, that means that once somebody moves out, all 4 units, you're definitely cash flowing in that situation. Like, why would somebody sell this great cash flowing asset? So these 3 and 4 unit properties are a lot harder to find than people make them out to be. But let's talk about living rent free, which is most likely the situation most folks will be in. You're going to focus on the single family house hack, like I talked about, or buying a duplex with the goal of covering between like 50 to 80% of your mortgage, which is a great situation to be in because most likely your living expense in area X, let's say, is going to be $2,000, whether you're living by yourself or somebody else. If you can get somebody to pay you $1,000 or $1,500 and you're only paying like $500 out of pocket, all said and done for your living expense, you are winning in that situation. You don't have to be living rent free in order to win. Or let's say you're looking just to build your real estate portfolio. It's kind of like a delayed house hack. You buy a property for like a year, you live in it for a year, then you move out, and now you get a renter in that property, and you move to another property, and that renter is covering obviously the rent in there plus a little bit more. So that little bit more goes towards your mortgage on the property you're currently living in. And you just keep doing that until you're able to actually kind of break even or hopefully cash flow at a certain point. But in that situation, it may take, it'll take multiple properties, probably like 4 or 5 properties in order to finally break even. But that's how you kind of pay for that dream home at the end. You can do the temporary house hack, right? You're just doing house hacking for a little bit, so maybe just to get on your feet. You may want to house hack, like in my situation where my first house hack was for 5 years. So after that, I did have a pretty big nest egg built up where I could have just maybe put down like 20 or 30% on my next home instead of continuing to house hack. So there's various options there. And then there's just, hey, you want to sell the property in a few years. Once again, kind of the same thing. You're just kind of getting on your feet. Maybe you're young, you don't have a family, you're kind of living by yourself and just kind of building your real estate portfolio that way. So game plan. Once again, you're establishing these goals. Don't rely 100% on your realtor. Because here's the thing, no shade to any realtor, but your realtor does not understand the finances when it comes to house hacking. Some lenders don't even understand what the FHA self-sufficiency test is. So why would your realtor? And they may not have a background when it comes to investing, renting, analyzing properties. So you may analyzing the rent on properties. So you want to do that, or at least have some sort of baseline knowledge on your own, or maybe get with a realtor that knows what they're talking about there. Once again, I'll talk about that bid to bath ratio. If you're doing the single family house hack, to me, that is vital. You want to focus on certain area codes and zip codes that have stuff that is attractive to renters. I always like to focus on my property and say, hey, what would a renter like in this situation? You want to make sure you can focus on setting your budget. And so the price of the home you pick should be based on your budget. See other episodes on how to find the perfect home price, but that's a whole nother like 20-minute episode. And once again, you want to set your criteria for your realtor, but be flexible. Because honestly, no matter what price bracket you're in, there's going to be something where you're like, oh, I missed out on this, that, or the third, right? I think Beyonce and Jay-Z paid like $125 million for some like Beverly Hills estate or something I saw a few months back. And I'm sure they were looking at the home like, man, I wish it had X, Y, and Z on it still. It didn't have everything they wanted. So even the rich and the famous still want something or don't get everything they want when it comes to buying a home. Or maybe it was everything they wanted. So let's talk about different property types and how to house hack those property types. Yeah, so we have this single family property. Like this is a very, very overlooked aspect of house hacking. So you can have right here, which is called like the in-law suite. And so what the in-law suite is, you essentially have your house, but there's another unit attached to your house, which has all the amenities that your house has, just like a smaller version. It has a bathroom, it has kitchen, it has bedrooms, it has a living area. And so it's called the in-law suite because a lot of times in-laws will stay with the kids have the bigger property. They're older and they have the property, and the in-laws stay there instead of maybe going to a nursing home, or maybe unfortunately maybe somebody passed, but they have that in-law there. But it allows them to have their own separate living space, but also still be close to the family. But of course you can just use that to rent out to another person. And this is great because you don't have to worry about like zoning stuff, or you don't have to worry about like Airbnbs or short-term rentals, typically, which are being banned, short-term rentals in a lot of situations, or the whole HOA thing where they may say, hey, you can't have a short-term rental. It's like, hey, it's just my house. You can kind of do what you want to do there. Of course, you have the traditional single-family home where you can just rent out different bedrooms in the property. So you may want to put like, personal locks on the property. You may want to do like the digitized lock thing. So each person has their own lock in their own bedroom. So it's just kind of like their own separate space there. And then last but not least, my favorite is the condo, and I'll say slash townhome. Especially if you're a first-time home buyer, it's very, very low maintenance. And it's essentially like an apartment building that you have equity in and that you own. And so that's my recommendation if you're somebody that travels, or if you're like a first-time home buyer that's like scared of cutting the grass and all the other stuff, or potential maintenance that may come with owning a home, because there's very, very, very little maintenance that you have to do with a condo. You do have condo fees that pays for the vast majority of stuff around the condo. One thing to look at is, if you're a first-time home buyer and looking at a condo, you may want to get a bigger condo, because the more units, the kind of the least responsibility you have. Like if you're in like a smaller condo association, they may have like 5 to 10 condos. Well, when that roof has to be replaced, that's a much bigger burden on the 10 of you versus being in a building that may have like 50 different tenants. Just some food for thought there. And the bigger unit is probably more professionally managed versus maybe somebody, Tom, that works in logistics at Target or something. I'm a realtor in Dallas and would love to help you reach your goals of home ownership. So click the link in the description and just schedule a call no matter where you are on your journey. Not in Dallas, no worries. I can help connect you with a vetted realtor in your local jurisdiction as well. And feel free to share with friends, family, and foes. Everyone gets left like that. Now let's talk about the multifamily properties that we all know and love. So we have the duplex, as you can see. And the duplex here, they have their own convenient entrance. Triplex, 3 units, and then the fourplex, which is just 4 units. But something to note, and if you're listening to the podcast, I'll describe it. On this fourplex here, you'll notice it just looks like 4 separate houses on a lot. So what a lot of folks don't realize when it comes to a multifamily property, it's a multifamily property because they're all on the same lot. That is the only requirement. They don't have to be in a building, don't have to be in the walls that touch. So you can get a triplex that may be a duplex and a single family property all in the same lot. A situation like this where there are all 4 units, but they're all separate on the same lot. So that's kind of like the dream scenario, because a lot of times folks feel like they may be going back to the apartment life or for whatever reason. But once again, you can get a multi-family properties that don't touch each other. So you probably learned something there, didn't you? Now, what are some different ways to do it? Just get a roommate, right? Like I did, kind of do the long-term rental thing. You can get official paperwork or not. I always recommend getting official paperwork, because if something goes wrong, you want to make sure you have something in place in order to kind of eject the roommate if need be, if they're not like holding up their end of the bargain. You can do the Airbnb thing, no matter how many units, you can still do Airbnb. Airbnb even does for like single family properties where you can Airbnb a room. That always seems kind of weird to me, but I guess you can do that. Of course, the long-term rental, which is the traditional thing, you can also add a unit onto your property, like that in-law suite we talked about earlier. You can add that onto your property, or if it's zoned, you can do what's called an ADU, or an additional dwelling unit, which is just another unit that can be added onto the property. When I was in San Diego with my wife, like maybe 5 or 6 years ago, we stayed in an ADU in the back of somebody's unit, and I assume that ADU probably paid for that person's mortgage. paid a pretty penny for that unit because we're in downtown San Diego. But it was cool. Location, 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 as they say. But check zoning before you try to do any ADU situation, because you don't want to build a whole ADU and then find out you got to tear it down because it's not allowed. Another thing you can do is, hey, maybe you want to rent out your property and then just live in a trailer on the property, kind of like Jesse did in Breaking Bad. If you remember that, he had that trailer out front. But that's something you can do as well. You can buy a multifamily unit, of course, and live in one unit. That's kind of the traditional thing that people talk about. And also, don't forget, you can do like Section 8 renters. So a lot of folks are scared of Section 8, but that's just another way to get rent. And once again, that Section 8 money always comes because the government is paying for like 70, 80% of that person's mortgage for the most part. All right, let's talk about the ultimate house hack, the 4, 3, 2, 1 method. So once again, the max number of units you can do for a residential loan is 4 units. So why should you start at 4 units? Because if you're staying in the same geographic area, from a lending standpoint, going from a 4 unit to a 3 unit is considered a downgrade in your living conditions. Going from a 3 unit to a 4 unit is considered an upgrade, even sometimes if the property is better from an underwriting perspective. Because they're like, hey, this person that only has 2 tenants to deal with, they're in a 3 unit. Why would they want to go in this situation where they're now and have 3 tenants? That seems like they're taking on more responsibility, more hassle. And probably, man, they're doing this in order to build their real estate portfolio. So we're not going to allow them to use like an FHA loan and have it be a primary residence and only 3.5% down. So the issue with that is there are exceptions, which is we'll talk about in a second, but you don't know if those exceptions will be approved until you're actually under contract. So you can end up like losing your earnest money. The best way is to start high and then go low. Here are a couple of workarounds though. If you end up in a situation where, like, for some reason you start off with a duplex and you're like, oh man, I should have really went with this 3 or 4 unit property. So if one of the units are detached, right? So you're in like a triplex and you're going to a fourplex, but the fourplex is a triplex on one lot in another single family unit. Now, like I know a person that has this setup, so that's looked at as an upgrade because the actual unit that you're living in is pretty much a single family property for all intents and purposes. Another thing, if you're moving more than 50 miles and closer to the job, they're no longer in the same geographic region from underwriting standards. And so it's like, okay, this person just needs another property to live in. It just happens to be a multifamily property. Once again, if you're getting like a significantly bigger unit, if you're like in a duplex that may be 1,000 square feet, and you got a triplex where your units are going to be like 1,500 square feet, or maybe a 2-bedroom into like a 3-bedroom, that's considered like an upgrade, more rooms in. Or you can show there's some sort of like safety issue, like maybe you bought like in a not so savory neighborhood and it's a duplex and you're moving to a nice triplex in the into whatever you consider a nicer neighborhood. Here are a couple of things that I mentioned to pay attention to when you're embarking on this great scheme. Once again, what are the HOA guidelines? So they may not allow any sort of rentals at all, long-term or short-term. Especially important to note if you're in a condo, because sometimes they'll be like, hey, only 10 or 20% of the condo can be rented out. And they do that because it helps maintain the prices or values of the condo. Like if you have a condo where half the units are being rented out, Airbnb or long-term, it's essentially an apartment building, and folks don't want to live there. And there's no shade to anyone, but on average, people that own a property take more care of it than people that are renting the property. That's just kind of is what it is statistically. Like I said, no individual shade to anyone. You want to make sure you're aware of city ordinances. So if you have this grand plan to like maybe put an ADU on your property, you have to see, is this property zoned for an ADU? Is it zoned for multifamily use if you're looking to add another unit onto the property? Is the neighborhood even desirable in the first place? Like, there may be a reason that you're getting this great 4-unit property. As I talked about, they're hard to find. It could be because maybe something's happening and the neighborhood is transitioning for whatever reason from the good to the bad. It could be just like a bad area to live in. You got to note, like, vacancies as well. So when you're buying a property, you want to look at like the rent rolls to see like what the occupancy is and the amount of people that are actually paying rent, because maybe they're selling this property because the tenants are not paying rent. So it's like, okay, I got this multifamily property, but I'm not getting any income, and there are people in the unit. So that's kind of like a L. So you want to make sure that you're aware of the vacancy. And if there's actually the income coming from the people that are in the properties. You want to be any repairs that are needed in order to upgrade the property as well. And once again, who am I renting to? Especially if there's somebody already in the unit, and liability as well. The more units, the more people, the more stairs and all this, the more liability issues you could potentially have when being a landlord. All right, so let's talk about different loan programs and how they impact this process. So a conventional loan, this is ideal if you're looking at like a single family property condo, because your minimum down payment is going to be 3 or 5% based on your status as a first time home buyer. Also, mortgage insurance, there's mortgage insurance if you put down less than 20% on the property, but it drops off at the 80% loan to value ratio, meaning that there's at least 20% equity in the property, meaning that you paid down the loan 20%, or that the value of the property went up at least to whatever number gives you 20% equity in relation to the loan. You also don't need any reserves in most situations when getting a conventional loan. Reserves are basically additional mortgage payments you need to have on the side. You don't give those to the lender, but sometimes they'd be like, hey, you need to have 3 months of reserves at closing. And they just check the reserve at closing. They don't like follow up to make sure you keep those reserves forever. But that's additional money you need to at least have on the side. You're going to need at least a 620 credit score, and your loan limits are going to be way higher than FHA loan limits. So right now, I believe the conventional loan limit is $726,000, and the FHA loan limit is in the $400,000 threshold. And your debt to income ratio can go all the way up to 50%. All right, so FHA, everyone's favorite loan to house hack with. This is ideal for 2 to 4 unit properties because your down payment is only 3.5%, whether it's a 2, 3, or 4 unit property. But some of the cons are the mortgage insurance on the loan lasts forever, no matter what your loan to value ratio is. You also pay upfront mortgage insurance, which is about 1.7% of the loan amount. So typically this is financed right into the loan, so folks really don't realize that it's happening. But that's why when you close on an FHA loan, your loan to value ratio will be less than 76.5%, which would be the case for putting down 3.5%. You're going to need at least 3 months of reserves. Once again, the loan limits are lower. The inspection is stricter as far as there's certain things that have to be fixed from a safety aspect, which is why realtors sometimes are scared of those. And as a result of realtors being scared of those, they'll recommend that their seller to not take an FHA offer if there is an equivalent or maybe close enough conventional offer, because they don't have to want to worry about like falling out of escrow. There's another aspect of the FHA loan called the mandatory clause, which says that if the home is not appraised for the value in the contract, that the seller can back out at any time and still get the earnest money back. So they don't want to have to deal with that mandatory clause as well. You have the lower credit score requirements, 580. Your debt to income ratio can be 43%. But in both situations, with an FHA property, you're able to add the rental income towards your income as well to help you qualify for a higher limit. But last but not least, very, very, very important, especially if you're in a high cost of living area. So we're talking about like the Calis, New Yorks, you must pass the FHA self-sufficiency test. And this hinders a lot of folks in those high cost living areas because sometimes it's very hard to pass. All right, let's break down the FHA self-sufficiency test. What it says is that on 3 to 4 unit properties, your principal, interest, taxes, insurance, and HOA dues payment, if applicable, cannot be more than 75% of your rent. So I have 2 examples here. On one example, we both have fourplexes. On one fourplex, your principal and interest payment, tax and insurance payment is $3,400, and your total rent is $4,800. So 75% of that $4,800 is $3,600. So this one does not pass the test. So it doesn't matter if your credit score is 850, your DTI is 3%, and you have 1,000 months of reserves. You cannot pass, or you will not be able to do an FHA loan in this situation. In example 2, we have a principal, interest, taxes, and insurance payment of $3,300, and the total rents come to $4,500. So 75% of that is $3,375. So in this scenario, the loan or the property passes the FHA self-sufficiency test. This is the FHA guideline, not your lender's guideline, so they can't skirt around the requirements. So what happens if you're above the limit? Well, you can't get the loan, but if it makes sense, you may want to put down like maybe a higher down payment. So maybe you have an FHA loan, you're putting down like 3.5%. Maybe you got to put down 5% or maybe even 10% in order to pass the FHA self-sufficiency test. You may be thinking, hey, that's a lot of money. Yeah, it is a lot of money, but if you're using a conventional loan, most likely you're going to be putting down like close to like 20 to 25% for a conventional loan. So compare that 10% for that FHA scenario versus the 25% on a conventional loan. And so the reason for this loan is really one of the few things the government gets right. And so think about it, if you have a 4-unit property, they're saying that, hey, if something happens to anyone's income in the property, or if anyone in the property is not paying rent for any reason, that the other 3 units have to cover the mortgage. So whether that's you that loses your job or just wants to hang out and live rent free, or you have a vacancy or somebody just decides to not pay rent, you're still covered in that scenario. All right, let's talk about a VA loan. So you must be a veteran or unfortunately a widow to a veteran. You got to have at least a 620 credit score. Technically, there's no minimum guideline for a VA loan, but you're going to need a 620 credit score to do the multifamily thing. You're going to need at least 6 months of reserves. You want to get a realtor that understands how VA loans work. A lot of times, just realtors are just ignorant. I mean, ignorant in the way of just don't understand, and they're just scared of VA loans, and they run the other way and steer their clients away. So we want to have a realtor that can articulate what a VA loan is and not to be scared of it. So a VA loan, believe it or not, is actually the least defaulted loan of any of the loan programs. And then there's no mortgage insurance for a VA loan either. So boom, there you go there. And so now you have a tenant, or you have the multifamily property. Like, what do you do about these tenants? So how do you get a tenant in the property? So one, you want to work with a realtor. Like, you probably bought the property using a realtor. Now you want to put the realtor to work to help you find tenants to fill out the property. And most likely they'll be more than welcome to do that. Or you can have like a property management company do it as well. And a property management company is good because they're going to kind of manage everything for you, especially if it's a unit you don't want to deal with and you actually want to live like the rent-free, stress-free life. You can have a property management company do it. They're going to charge you maybe about 10% of the rents. Also, you need to have just in general, like a screening process in place, because the worst thing you can do is to get somebody that's, smiling and grinning in your face, then they move into the property and they're not paying rent, or maybe they're just a headache in general for the other tenants, and other tenants want to move out because this person maybe is doing illegal activities, or just being allowed, or they're being, whatever in the property. So you want to make sure that you're screening those tenants. You want to make sure you're doing a credit check, because if they have like a history of evictions and stuff like that, if they've done it once, they probably would do it with you as well. So I'm all for giving people a second chance, but that's just something you got to think about. It's like, this person has a history of being evicted. Like, what circumstances have changed that they're going to end up paying you rent? So that's something you may want to talk to that person about if you're considering somebody that has been evicted from a property. So once again, you want to make sure you're interviewing them and getting a good vibe for them as well, because as the great Chris Rock says, when you're meeting somebody the first time, you're just meeting their representative. So you want to make sure you can kind of peel back that onion and verify the income and the previous landlord. And so actually call the landlord and just call and say, hey, you're looking for a property. The reason why to call and say, hey, you're looking for a property, because if they just told their friend Chris to say they're your reference and they don't own any properties or they're not a landlord, they'll be like, huh, what are you talking about? So now you know that they're not really a landlord, right? But if you call them, you're like, hey, I'm doing a background check on Chris. They'll be like, oh yeah. Chris was great. X, Y, this, that, and the third. And so they can kind of okie doke you when it comes to that aspect. And once again, you want to make sure you're actually verifying their income as well. Also, feel free to do a social media check. If they're being John Morant in their pictures on Instagram or TikTok or whatever, or Facebook, like, that's probably what they're going to be doing in your unit. So just a little bit food for thought there. And some tools that you can use to kind of do background checks are like Advale and Rent Spree. I think Cozy was actually bought by apartments.com. And so that's some stuff on screening your tenants. So now that you've like house hacked and you're doing all this great stuff, like, what now? What's the next step? So you want to make sure you're like doing something with this money, in my opinion. You don't want to just be So now you're saving $1,000 or more a month. You don't want to be spending $1,000 a month, so you're just still breaking even. You're living a better lifestyle, but you're not really gaining anything from a financial asset because, in my opinion, the whole goal of living rent free is to stack money so that if you don't have a side hustle, you can leave your job as soon as possible. So invest, invest, invest. As far as resources, YouTube University, you're there right now, or maybe listen to the podcast, Google University as well. So if you got any questions, hit me up, DM me, email me at hello@houserichshow.com. I'm a realtor here in Dallas and would love to help you reach your real estate goals. So that's it. Buy land. Rumor has it they're not making any more of it.